Good morning, YouTube, and welcome to the world of tools you didn't think you needed. This is my new Ancel battery analyzer, fresh from the People's Republic. Is it accurate? Can you trust it? Who the f*** knows? Nobody, that's who. Let's change that. If you're the kind of person who likes to gamble on cheap tools, stick around, because you might like what you see. These things exist in a weird dichotomy where you can get really cheap ones or really expensive ones, but nothing in between. I'm a man who loves the mid-range. I've done well enough in life that I don't want to settle for a cheap Chevy, but I can't quite afford the Cadillac. I want a nice mid-range Buick. Nobody makes a Buick battery analyzer, so I'm forced to choose between either end of the spectrum here. Representing the high end, I've got the Snap-on EECS 400A, a true commercial-grade analyzer that's as accurate as it was expensive. I assume. But you know what happens when you assume. On the low end, this Ancel BST200 from Amazon. It has a German email address and one from Shenzhen, China. I think one of these countries is trying to borrow credibility from the one with a better reputation. I wonder which one. And of course, no tool comparison is complete without an entry from everyone's favorite love to hate, hate to love tool company, Harbor Freight. I borrowed this one from a nice guy in Florida who's going to have to thaw it out when I send it back to him from my workshop here on Hoff. The real question here is accuracy. For this test, I've got the whole fleet engaged as a sample group. We have the aircraft carrier with an 800 cold cranking amp battery, the luxury liner with a 640 cold cranking amp battery, the speedboat with a 750 cold cranking amp battery, and the dinghy here at a quaint 320 cold cranking amps. All batteries will be fully topped off with the same make and model battery charger in between tests, which will occur indoors at a constant 42 degrees freedom. I'll record the battery voltage, internal resistance, and the measured cold cranking amps for each tester, and just see how close they are. A good experiment would compare a veritable buttload of testers. Bigger sample size makes for more reliable data, but if you couldn't tell by the lighting and audio quality, this channel ain't big enough to monetize, so the budget is what my wife says it is. Scientific method be damned. I know the lighting in here isn't the best for filming, and I could move everything outside for this, but the temperature's not constant out there, and if I'm honest, I just don't think I like you guys enough to go out there in this. With that being said, we'll start with the aircraft carrier. The Centec measures 13.3 volts, 3.7 milliohms of resistance, and 712 cold cranking amps. The Ancel measures 13.1 volts, 767 cold cranking amps, and 4.11 milliohms of internal resistance. Pretty close. The Snap-on measures... No, this is not an AGM battery. 13.2 volts and 892 cold cranking amps. It doesn't actually give you internal resistance, which is a bummer for this test, but in the real world it doesn't matter because it'll just give you a bad cell warning if it's out of spec. Next up, the dinghy. The Centec measures this wee little battery at 13.0 volts, 6 milliohms of internal resistance, and 441 cold cranking amps. The Ancel measures 13.1 volts, 478 cold cranking amps, and 6.5 milliohms of resistance. The Snap-on measures the dinghy battery at 13.0 volts and 486 cold cranking amps. Moving on to the luxury liner, the Centec measures 12.3 volts, 4.67 milliohms of resistance, and 567 cold cranking amps. The Ancel measures 12.42 volts, 579 cold cranking amps, and 5.4 milliohms of resistance. And the Snap-on. The Snap-on measures 12.4 volts and 670 cold cranking amps. And lastly, the speedboat. The Centec measures 12.9 volts, 4 milliohms of resistance, and 667 cold cranking amps. The Ancel measures 12.8 volts, 711 cold cranking amps, I'm just going to say cranking, and 4.4 milliohms of internal resistance. And finally, the Snap-on. The Snap-on measures, no, stop asking me, 12.9 volts and 874 cold cranking amps, quite high. So, which one is right? Well, as you can see, all three do a fine job of measuring no-load voltage, but that is the easy part. The bargain options were pretty close with their internal resistance measurements, with the Ancel consistently reading just a little bit higher, just a fraction of a milliohm. I assume that's down to the way the leads are constructed, which province of China they were made in, or even how tight they were connected to the battery terminals. The snap-on is disqualified here, as it doesn't think I'd like to know the internal resistance and therefore does not measure it. And as for cold cranking amps, the analyzers in the budget-friendly camp were reasonably consistent with each other, with the Ancel, again, reading only a few percentage points higher. Meanwhile, the Snap-on is giving me some really high outlier data points, but a good scientist does not dismiss outliers, especially with a puny sample size of 3. Without some sort of control, though, it's hard to say, hard but not impossible, which camp is correct. This is where the video starts getting a little mathy, so if you want to skip ahead, go to here. My feelings won't be hurt. Much. Ohm's law. Voltage, current, and resistance. Basically, if you know 2, this law allows you to rearrange the formula to calculate the third. This is how these analyzers calculate the cranking amps. They measure the voltage drop over a resistive load and calculate the cranking amps. Amps? Why did they use an I for amps? The Germans. So, with this NIST traceable calibrated multimeter, we can easily measure a battery's no-load voltage and compare that to the analyzers. It's a little more tricky, but we can also measure the battery's internal resistance and compare that to the analyzers. If those cheap analyzers read the internal resistance right and the no-load voltage right, we can assume it's calculating the current right as well, unless the firmware skipped 5th grade algebra. Unfortunately, the Snap-on won't give me internal resistance, but you get what you get and you don't get upset. Going to use this spare battery so I don't have to reset my radio presets. This is what they measured for voltage compared to the actual, and as you can see, they all did a very good job of getting the right voltage. Measuring internal resistance requires a consistent load. You could use a resistor, but they can lose resistance a little as they warm up, so I'm going to use this halogen headlight bulb. It's a much more consistent load. We also need to use another law, Kirchhoff's voltage law. This law states that the sum of the voltage in the circuit must be equal to the sum of all the voltage drops in that circuit. This means that the total no-load battery voltage, or we'll call it V battery, must equal the internal voltage drop, or call it V internal, plus the voltage drop across my load, which I'll call V load. The unloaded battery voltage came in at 13.13 volts. To get V internal, I first need V load. My meter is set for DC volts in parallel with the bulb. I'm doing this quickly so I don't drain the battery and skew the results. 13.07. Damn, that's a big drop. This battery really is toast. Kirchhoff's law states that the difference between the battery voltage and the voltage drop across the bulb will be the voltage drop that's due to the battery's internal resistance, in this case 60 millivolts. Once we find I, we can calculate R. I'm going to put the meter in amps and connect it in series with the battery and the bulb to get the current draw. 4.052 amps. So we'll plug our numbers into the formula. 0.06 volts divided by 4.052 amps gives us 14.8 milliohms. Let's see what the Centec thinks. 12.1 milliohms, that's really close. And let's see what the Ancel thinks. 14.5 milliohms of resistance. That's really, really close. So, what do I think? Well, I'm not going to say these modern cheap Chinese analyzers are better than a modern Snap-on analyzer. That's crazy talk. But they're definitely better than this old Snap-on analyzer. And plus, they're more compact. And since the Snap-on is wireless, you need a 9-volt battery just to run the thing. Both of these are the same price, basically. They also have poorly translated manuals, but they're also pretty intuitive and easy to figure out. They're also impressively accurate. I think the deciding factor between them is, what's your favorite color? Do you like red or do you like yellow? Hey, anyone want a good deal on a Snap-on battery analyzer? Also, thanks for watching. Have a good day.